Do you remember those funny TV shows from the 1970s? The ones that filled living rooms with laughter yet somehow slipped away? These comedies were daily rituals, pulling families together around the TV. If they mattered so deeply then, why did we forget them? Soap was not just another sitcom from the 1970s, it was an event. Imagine turning on the television at night and instead of the safe, predictable stories of family life or workplace banter, you were greeted with murder mysteries, kidnappings, and secret affairs, all told in a way that mocked the over-the-top drama of daytime soaps. The brilliance was that the characters never knew they were funny. They played it completely straight, with serious faces while their lives unraveled into chaos. It had cliffhangers at the end of every episode, leaving audiences desperate to see what absurd twist would happen next. It even introduced one of television's first openly gay characters in Jody Dallas, played by Billy Crystal, which was bold and controversial at the time. Soap was both parody and trailblazer, poking fun at the drama while making history in its own right. That combination made it unforgettable, even if it has faded from memory for many today. Mary Hartman. Mary Hartman was unlike anything else on television in the 1970s. It looked like a soap opera at first glance, but it was twisted in the strangest and funniest ways possible. She played a housewife trapped in the dull routines of suburban life, but the series constantly spun the ordinary into the absurd. Scenes about clogged drains, broken appliances, or awkward neighborhood conversations would suddenly escalate into darkly hilarious territory. The show aired daily, 5 nights a week, which gave it the same addictive quality as a soap opera, but with comedy that pushed boundaries. The repetition of Mary's name in the title became part of the joke. It was monotonous, much like the routines the show mocked. People either loved it or hated it, but no one could forget it. For fans, it became a cult classic that perfectly captured the weird underbelly of the American dream. Looking back, it is easy to see why Mary Hartman stood out as one of the strangest and funniest experiments of its era. Few shows captured the joyful silliness of the 1970s quite like Laverne and Shirley. Starring Penny Marshall and Cindy Williams, the sitcom followed two best friends working at a Milwaukee brewery, and their lives were filled with non-stop antics. Laverne was the tough, street-smart one with her L stitched on her sweaters, while Shirley was the more innocent dreamer who often got pulled into the chaos. Together, they turned the most ordinary problems, dating mishaps, rent troubles, factory mix-ups, into comedic gold. The show also gave us one of the most memorable opening themes of the decade, with Laverne and Shirley chanting their made-up Yiddish rhyme before skipping off together. Laverne and Shirley was not about complicated plots or biting satire. It was about two women who faced the world with optimism, humor, and loyalty to each other. Even now, the show is remembered for its warmth as much as its slapstick. It was a comforting reminder that no matter how messy life got, you could get through it with a laugh and a friend. WKRP in Cincinnati gave audiences a hilarious inside look at a struggling radio station, and it became one of the smartest comedies of the 1970s. The humor came from the clash of personalities: the earnest but clueless station manager, the eccentric disc jockeys, the glamorous receptionist, and the ever-patient newsman who seemed constantly exasperated by the circus around him. The station was supposed to play rock music, but half the time no one knew what they were doing. Equipment failed, promotions went wrong, and the staff stumbled from one disaster to the next, often leaving listeners in stitches. One of the show's most famous episodes involved a Thanksgiving promotion gone horribly wrong, with live turkeys being dropped from a helicopter, an idea so ridiculous that it cemented the show's place in sitcom history. But WKRP also had heart. For audiences, it was both a laugh and a reflection of the real changes happening in radio and pop culture at the time. What made WKRP in Cincinnati unforgettable was its balance of goofy humor with just enough truth to make you nod and laugh at the same time. Barney Miller was not a typical police show. Instead of car chases or crime-solving action, the sitcom took place almost entirely inside a New York City precinct office. The humor came from the characters, not the cases. Captain Barney Miller himself was calm, patient, and often the only voice of reason in a room full of eccentrics. His detectives each brought their own quirks: the laid-back Detective Harris, the perpetually tired Yamana, the grumpy Wojciechowicz, and many others who kept the station buzzing with personality. What made the show special was its ability to blend laughs with a sense of humanity. Viewers did not just laugh at them, they cared about them. Barney Miller showed that even in a tough, gritty city like New York, humor was everywhere if you looked closely enough. While many sitcoms went for big punchlines, Barney Miller thrived on small, character-driven moments that revealed both flaws and warmth. It was quirky, clever, and quietly brilliant, which is why it has never fully disappeared from memory. The Jeffersons was born as a spin-off from All in the Family, but it quickly became a television powerhouse in its own right. At the center was George Jefferson, played by Sherman Hemsley, whose wisecracks and unstoppable confidence made him one of the most memorable characters of the decade. The show followed George, his wife Louise, and their move into a luxury apartment up in the East Side, capturing both the comedy and the cultural shifts of the era. George's bluster often got him into trouble, but it was always entertaining. Louise, or Wheezy, was his grounding force, rolling her eyes at his antics, but also reminding viewers of the heart beneath the bluster. The Jeffersons also gave audiences unforgettable supporting characters, including their eccentric British neighbor Bentley and their sharp-tongued housekeeper Florence. For many viewers, it was inspiring, even as it kept them laughing. The Jeffersons proved that sitcoms could be both funny and socially meaningful, a rare balance that few shows ever pulled off. Good Times was more than just a family sitcom. It was a cultural touchstone of the 1970s. Centered on the Evans family living in a Chicago housing project, the show mixed humor with the struggles of working-class life. At the heart was James and Florida Evans, trying to raise their children with dignity and love despite financial hardship. The comedy came from the family's resilience, their banter, and of course, the unforgettable character of JJ, whose catchphrase, "Dynamite," became a national sensation. Audiences tuned in not only to laugh, but to see reflections of real challenges: rent struggles, neighborhood troubles, and the ups and downs of family life. What made Good Times stand out was its honesty. It did not shy away from tough issues, yet it always found humor in the cracks. Families watching at home felt seen, and at the same time, they were entertained. The chemistry of the cast made the show shine, with Esther Roll and John Amos providing grounded performances, while Jimmy Walker brought the comedic spark. Even the youngest characters had sharp lines that added to the laughs. Good Times managed to mix reality with comedy in a way that felt both refreshing and important. It was proof that sitcoms did not need fancy settings or gimmicks, just strong characters, heartfelt writing, and humor that resonated with everyday life. That is why its catchphrases and moments are still remembered fondly today. Alice was a sitcom that took the simple setting of a roadside diner and turned it into a stage for comedy gold. The story followed Alice, a widow starting fresh as a waitress at Mel's Diner, a greasy spoon run by a gruff but lovable owner. Every shift brought new laughs thanks to the colorful staff and customers who came through the door. But the breakout star was Flo, the wisecracking waitress with a southern drawl and a sharp tongue. Her one-liners, especially her famous "Kiss My Grits," became part of 1970s pop culture. The charm of Alice was that it felt familiar. Anyone who had ever been to a diner could recognize the types of people who came in, from the regulars with odd habits to the travelers passing through. The diner became more than a workplace. It was a family of misfits who found humor and comfort in each other. Alice herself was the heart of the show, balancing motherhood, work, and the search for a better life, while Flo provided the sass and spark that kept things lively. The mix of heartfelt moments and laugh-out-loud humor made the show a hit with audiences. People saw themselves in the struggles of the characters, but also enjoyed the escape of their exaggerated personalities. Alice proved that even the most ordinary settings could be hilarious if the characters were strong enough. And Mel's Diner will always be remembered as one of television's funniest pit stops. Maude was not afraid to stir things up. Played by B. Arthur, Maude Findlay was sharp-tongued, outspoken, and impossible to ignore. The show, created by Norman Lear, tackled controversial topics head-on, but always with humor at its core. Maude was the kind of character who said what others were only thinking, and she did it with perfect comedic timing. She was witty, sarcastic, and often brutally honest, which made her both hilarious and refreshing. The sitcom pushed boundaries in ways few others dared, addressing issues like women's rights, politics, and social change while still delivering laughs. Maude's interactions with her husband Walter, her daughter Carol, and her eccentric neighbors gave the show endless comedic possibilities. But it was B. Arthur's delivery, those raised eyebrows, her booming voice, and her cutting remarks that made Maude unforgettable. The show was fearless in its comedy, reflecting the social upheaval of the 1970s and giving audiences something to both laugh at and think about. For viewers, Maude was more than a sitcom character. She was a symbol of independence, a woman unafraid to speak her mind. That boldness, combined with razor-sharp humor, made the show a classic of its time. Watching Maude was like watching a comedy act wrapped in social commentary, and that is exactly why it remains one of the funniest and most daring sitcoms of the decade. Rhoda was a spin-off from The Mary Tyler Moore Show, and it quickly established itself as a hit in its own right. Valerie Harper's character, Rhoda Morgenstern, moved back to New York to start a new life, and her sharp wit and self-deprecating humor made the show endlessly entertaining. Unlike many sitcom heroines, Rhoda was not glamorous or polished. She was relatable, funny, and always in the middle of some awkward situation. Her adventures navigating work, friendships, and relationships gave audiences a steady stream of laughs. Rhoda's interactions with her family, especially her overbearing mother, provided some of the show's best comedy. It was a sitcom built on character-driven humor, with Rhoda's quick comebacks and quirky personality stealing the spotlight. What made the show stand out was its warmth. Underneath the jokes, Rhoda was about a woman trying to find her place in the world, and audiences connected with her struggles and triumphs. The humor was sharp but never mean-spirited, and it reflected the challenges of urban life in the 1970s with honesty and charm. Valerie Harper's performance made Rhoda one of the most beloved characters of the decade, and the show captured her perfectly. It was funny, heartfelt, and always engaging, reminding viewers that even when life was messy, you could still laugh your way through it. That combination is what kept audiences tuning in week after week. Phyllis was one of the quirkier spin-offs to come from The Mary Tyler Moore Show, and it leaned heavily on Cloris Leachman's comedic brilliance. Her character, Phyllis Lindstrom, had already become well known for her sharp remarks and awkward charm, so giving her a series of her own made perfect sense. The sitcom followed Phyllis after she returned to her hometown of San Francisco, adjusting to widowhood while moving in with her in-laws. The show's humor came from watching Phyllis try to navigate ordinary life with her signature blend of confidence and cluelessness. She had the ability to turn the simplest conversation into an uncomfortable spectacle, yet her quick wit kept her lovable. Cloris Leachman had impeccable timing, often saying things no one else would dare, but in such a matter-of-fact tone that it felt natural. The situations Phyllis landed in were often everyday challenges, work, relationships, parenting, but they always spun into hilarity because of her personality. The writing gave her plenty of room to show off both her sharpness and her vulnerability, reminding audiences that behind the witty quips was a woman just trying to make sense of her new life. The result was a series filled with laughs, awkward moments, and a lead performance that stood out in the crowded world of 1970s sitcoms. Chico and the Man brought together one of the unlikeliest comedic duos of the 1970s. The story centered on Ed Brown, a cranky old garage owner played by Jack Albertson, and Chico, a young, optimistic mechanic played by Freddie Prinze. Their relationship was the heart of the show, full of bickering, cultural clashes, and eventually, deep respect. Ed was set in his ways, gruff and often cynical, while Chico saw the best in people and situations. That contrast created endless opportunities for both humor and heartfelt moments. Audiences loved watching Ed soften little by little as Chico's charm and optimism wore down his tough exterior. The comedy often came from Chico's quick comebacks and clever ways of getting around Ed's stubbornness, while Ed's grouchy one-liners provided their own laughs. But the show was more than just jokes. It highlighted generational and cultural differences, offering a glimpse into the changing face of America in the 1970s. Sadly, the series became overshadowed by Freddie Prinze's tragic death, but for the years it aired, it made a lasting impact. Chico and the Man showed that humor could be both funny and healing, bridging gaps between people who seemed worlds apart. The chemistry between the leads made it unforgettable for anyone who watched. One Day at a Time stood out in the 1970s for tackling single motherhood in a way that was both funny and heartfelt. The show followed Ann Romano, a recently divorced mother raising her two teenage daughters, Julie and Barbara, in Indianapolis. This was not the polished image of family life that many sitcoms had shown before. Instead, it was messy, relatable, and filled with both laughter and frustration. Bonnie Franklin brought a warm, determined presence to Anne, showing the strength and humor needed to navigate life as a single parent. The daughters provided plenty of comedy, with Julie often challenging rules and Barbara bringing a lighter energy. The show was funny in its day-to-day struggles, money troubles, dating mishaps, sibling squabbles, but it also dared to take on heavier themes like sexism, independence, and personal growth. And of course, audiences loved Schneider, the quirky building superintendent whose comic relief balanced the more serious moments. What made One Day at a Time so memorable was its balance of realism and humor. It reminded audiences that family life was rarely perfect, but it could still be full of love and laughter. For many viewers, it was one of the first sitcoms that truly looked like their own lives. Fish gave audiences a closer look at Detective Phil Fish, one of the most popular characters from Barney Miller. Abe Vigoda played Fish with a world-weary face and the driest humor imaginable, and his deadpan delivery had already made him a fan favorite. The spin-off moved him away from the bustling precinct and into a more unusual situation, fostering a group of children with his wife Bernice. The comedy came from Fish's attempts to adjust to this new life, where instead of dealing with criminals, he was now managing kids with big personalities and even bigger demands. His gruff demeanor and constant complaints were a perfect contrast to the youthful energy around him. The humor was gentle, more situational than slapstick, and often laced with Fish's understated one-liners. Abe Vigoda's delivery made even the simplest phrase hilarious because it sounded like the sigh of a man who had seen it all. While Fish did not last as long as its parent series, it left an impression for how it blended heart with comedy. The foster care setup allowed for touching moments while still giving plenty of room for laughs. It showed another side of the character, one that was unexpectedly warm beneath all the grumbling. Flo took the most colorful character from Alice and gave her the spotlight she deserved. Polly Holliday's Flo had already become a fan favorite with her sharp tongue and unforgettable catchphrase, "Kiss my grits." In this spin-off, Flo left Mel's Diner behind to buy a roadhouse in Texas, and the laughs followed her every step of the way. The show leaned into Flo's brash, no-nonsense personality, putting her in charge of her own business where she could clash with customers, employees, and just about anyone who crossed her path. What made it work was that Flo was both tough and lovable. She could cut someone down with a remark and then flash a smile that made you root for her. The roadhouse setting provided endless possibilities for comedy, from rowdy patrons to small-town rivalries. The humor was a mix of sass, slapstick, and good old-fashioned personality clashes. Fans who loved Flo on Alice enjoyed seeing her run the show on her own terms, proving that her character had more than enough spark to carry a series. While it may not have had the same staying power as Alice, Flo was pure fun, fueled by Holliday's fiery performance. CPO Sharkey was exactly what you would expect from a sitcom starring Don Rickles, loud, sarcastic, and packed with rapid-fire insults. Rickles played Chief Petty Officer Otto Sharkey, a Navy man tasked with training a group of young recruits. The setup was perfect for his comedy style, as Sharkey constantly poked fun at the inexperience, quirks, and mistakes of his trainees. Every episode felt like a stage for Rickles' unmatched ability to roast anyone in sight. His biting humor spared no one, yet it was delivered with enough charm that it felt more funny than mean-spirited. The recruits, played by a diverse cast of characters, gave Sharkey plenty of material to work with, and the series leaned into the generational clash between the seasoned officer and the fresh faces of the Navy. Beyond the jokes, there was a certain warmth in the way Sharkey looked out for his recruits, even if he expressed it through wisecracks. It captured the essence of Rickles' comedy, sharp, cutting, but ultimately endearing. The show might not have been groundbreaking, but it was pure entertainment, carried by Rickles' one-of-a-kind personality. Fans tuned in simply to hear what outrageous line he would fire off next. Carter Country brought its laughs straight from the heart of a small southern town. Set in the fictional community of Clinton Corners, the show focused on a sheriff's office where the biggest challenges often came from egos and politics rather than crime. Victor French played Sheriff Darrell Harper, a man trying to balance common sense with the demands of small-town life. The humor came from the clash between Harper's steady approach and the antics of his deputy and townsfolk. The show played on stereotypes of small-town politics, poking fun at bureaucracy, gossip, and the sometimes absurd priorities of local leaders. Characters were exaggerated just enough to be funny but still recognizable to anyone who had lived in a tight-knit community. Carter Country was not about fast-paced action, but about small, character-driven moments. The comedy came from conversations in the office, arguments over policy, and the everyday quirks of rural life. For viewers, it was a chance to laugh at the silliness of small-town government while still appreciating its charm. While the show never reached the heights of some of its peers, it offered a unique slice of 1970s humor that was both familiar and entertaining. The Bob Newhart Show gave television one of its most distinctive comedic voices. Bob Newhart's style was calm, dry, and deadpan, and the series leaned fully into it. He played Dr. Bob Hartley, a psychologist in Chicago juggling his eccentric patients, his witty wife Emily, and a group of friends who often created more problems than solutions. The humor was understated, built around Bob's quiet reactions rather than loud punchlines. His patients were hilariously neurotic, his colleagues often exasperating, and Emily provided sharp balance with her own clever lines. What made the show stand out was its ability to get big laughs out of small moments. Bob pausing, stammering, or giving one of his perfectly timed double takes could carry an entire scene. The show's writing was sharp, and its ensemble cast gave it endless comedic potential. Audiences loved the way it captured the everyday frustrations of marriage, work, and relationships, all filtered through Newhart's unique sense of timing. It was never over the top, but always reliably funny. The Bob Newhart Show was proof that comedy did not have to shout to be hilarious. It became a cornerstone of 1970s television and helped cement Newhart's place as one of the greats of subtle comedy. The Tony Randall Show was exactly the kind of comedy you would expect from Tony Randall: sophisticated, fussy, and full of witty banter. Randall played Judge Walter Franklin, a Philadelphia judge whose courtroom was often less chaotic than his personal life. The humor came from watching Franklin try to balance the seriousness of his job with the absurdity of everyday family matters. Randall's performance made the show shine. He had a knack for turning pompousness into comedy, playing a man who always seemed slightly exasperated by the world around him. In the courtroom, he dealt with unusual cases and eccentric lawyers, while at home, he juggled raising his children and managing household mishaps. The writing gave Randall plenty of chances to deliver clever lines and show off his trademark dry style. The series was a mix of legal satire and family sitcom, and it stood out for its refined tone. While it may not have reached the lasting fame of some other 1970s comedies, it was a strong showcase for Randall's talents. For fans of smart, character-driven humor, The Tony Randall Show was a treat, offering laughs that came more from personality and wit than slapstick or chaos. Angie was a charming sitcom that played on the classic theme of opposites attracting. Donna Pescow starred as Angie Falco, a working-class woman from Philadelphia who unexpectedly fell in love with and married a wealthy doctor. The show followed Angie as she tried to adjust to the world of high society, bringing plenty of laughs along the way. The comedy came from the cultural and class clashes between her big, outspoken family and her new, refined in-laws. Angie herself was warm, funny, and down-to-earth, making her easy to root for even when she was out of her depth. The show had plenty of romantic charm, but it also leaned into situational humor as Angie tried to bridge the gap between her old life and her new one. Donna Pescow's performance made Angie relatable and lovable, capturing the awkwardness of being caught between two worlds. Audiences enjoyed the mix of romance and comedy, especially in an era when love stories on television were not always paired with big laughs. Angie may not have run as long as some of its contemporaries, but it left an impression with its sweet humor and clever take on class differences. It was lighthearted, romantic, and full of laughs that viewers still remember fondly. Busting Loose was a sitcom that perfectly captured the awkward excitement of stepping into adulthood. David Naughton starred as Lenny Markowitz, a young man finally moving out of his parents' home to experience life on his own terms. Of course, that freedom came with a steady stream of hilarious missteps. From apartment disasters to workplace blunders, Lenny stumbled through every corner of independence with the energy of someone who thought he was ready, but clearly was not. The comedy resonated with viewers who remembered their own first apartments with leaky faucets and quirky neighbors. Supporting characters added to the fun, especially the friends and family who alternated between helping and hindering his progress. The show had a mix of youthful charm and everyday relatability that made it feel familiar, even when the antics were over the top. Busting Loose was lighthearted but real, a reflection of how adulthood is never as smooth as you imagine it will be. Hot L Baltimore was classic Norman Lear, bold, funny, and unafraid to push boundaries. Set in a decaying hotel filled with eccentric tenants, the show thrived on the interactions of characters who were rarely seen on sitcoms at the time. Prostitutes, immigrants, and down-on-their-luck dreamers all lived under one roof, giving the series both grit and humor. The comedy came from their constant clashes and oddball conversations in the hotel lobby, where secrets spilled as freely as jokes. While the show only lasted one season, it stood out for daring to feature characters that television usually ignored. Lear's signature sharp writing gave them both laughs and dignity, making the humor land without losing heart. Audiences who discovered it remember it as a daring slice of 1970s comedy that felt ahead of its time. Its short run meant many forgot it, but for those who watched, Hot L Baltimore was one of the most unusual and daring sitcoms of the decade. Operation Petticoat took the hit 1959 film and brought it to television with a new cast, but the same playful spirit. The sitcom followed the misadventures of a World War II submarine crew that found itself painted pink and constantly entangled in chaos. The comedy came from the mix of military precision colliding with complete incompetence. Sailors bungled orders, ran into bizarre situations, and found themselves balancing naval duty with sheer silliness. The bright pink submarine itself was practically a character, a visual gag that never failed to remind audiences this was not your typical war story. The series leaned into slapstick humor, but it also delivered clever banter between officers and crew. Although it never reached the popularity of the film, it offered lighthearted fun at a time when television often looked for creative spins on familiar ideas. Operation Petticoat gave audiences laughs wrapped in military uniforms and painted in pink. Me and the Chimp was one of the stranger sitcom experiments of the 1970s. Ted Bessel played Mike Reynolds, a mild-mannered dentist whose household was turned upside down after adopting a mischievous chimpanzee named Buttons. The show leaned heavily on physical comedy, with Buttons constantly getting into trouble, wrecking the kitchen, messing with dental tools, or causing chaos in the neighborhood. Mike's attempts to restore order usually failed, leading to even bigger laughs. The humor was broad, silly, and unabashedly centered on the novelty of having a chimp in the family. For children, the antics were hilarious. For adults, it was charmingly ridiculous. While it only lasted a single season, Me and the Chimp embodied the playful experimentation of 1970s television. Not every idea stuck, but it certainly stood out for its sheer oddball premise. Today, it is remembered as one of those "did that really exist?" sitcoms that make television history fun to revisit. Phyllis took Cloris Leachman's unforgettable character from the Mary Tyler Moore Show and gave her a world of her own. As a recently widowed woman returning to San Francisco with her daughter, Phyllis Lindstrom tried to rebuild her life with confidence that often outpaced her actual abilities. The humor was in her awkward attempts to fit in, whether at work, in friendships, or navigating family life with her in-laws. Leachman's wit turned Phyllis into a lovable mess, someone who always said too much or the wrong thing but somehow made it funny. Every episode highlighted her knack for turning ordinary situations into laugh-filled disasters. The show gave her space to shine, showing both her biting comedic timing and her softer side. Audiences who enjoyed her on Mary Tyler Moore found even more reasons to laugh as she carried her own series. Though it did not last as long as other spin-offs, Phyllis was a witty, quirky gem of the 1970s. They were not just for carrying sandwiches and juice boxes. They were badges of honor. In the 1970s, metal lunchboxes with cartoon characters were everything to a kid. You marched into school like you owned the place if you had the Brady Bunch, Scooby-Doo, or Fat Albert slung over your arm. They clanged when you walked, chipped when you dropped them, and smelled like peanut butter forever. But they were yours. The thermos inside matched the design, with a plastic cup that screwed on top and often leaked just enough milk to give the lunchbox that signature sour scent. You would line them up on the windowsill during class or hide secret notes inside the lid. The paint would eventually chip, the latches would rust, but you never wanted to give it up. Today, they have been replaced by soft-sided, logo-free lunch carriers. But for those who grew up in that era, seeing one again brings back the sound of the bell, the taste of a bologna sandwich, and that magical feeling of opening your box and hoping you got a Hostess cupcake instead of raisins. They were loud, proud, and deeply personal. One glance at the dented metal, and the memories rush back like a school bell in September. Hot Wheels did not just roll, they roared. When Mattel launched the line in 1968, it changed the way kids thought about toy cars. These were not slow, blocky replicas. Hot Wheels were sleek, bright, and built to race. The original 16 models included muscle cars, hot rods, and custom builds with names like Beatnik Bandit and Diora. They had real speed thanks to low-friction wheels and metal axles. But the real magic came when you laid down that iconic orange track. Loops, curves, jumps. Suddenly, your hallway became Daytona. Kids spent hours building elaborate courses from couches to floorboards to staircases. Some cars went so fast they hit the baseboard and flipped into the next room. The cars were pocket-sized, but they carried the weight of imagination. Each new release felt like a discovery. Paint jobs were wild, details were sharp. Collectors started forming almost immediately. And while other toy cars looked good sitting still, Hot Wheels looked best in motion, blurring by in a flash of chrome and flame decals. For many, it was not just about racing. It was about building your own world, one piece of orange track at a time. There was something magical about a Saturday morning where math and grammar danced across your screen to a killer beat. Schoolhouse Rock was the rare mix of educational and unforgettable. Launched in the early 1970s, these animated shorts played during cartoon blocks, slipping in lessons between episodes of superheroes and slapstick. But they did not feel like school. They felt like music videos made just for kids, catchy, colorful, and endlessly clever. Conjunction Junction, I'm Just a Bill, 3 is a magic number. These were not just songs. They were memory hooks, hooks that stayed with you for life. Even now, adults who grew up in that era can still sing every word. That is how deep it went. That is how much it mattered. Schoolhouse Rock did not just teach facts, it taught confidence. You could walk into class knowing what an adverb was, not because of your teacher, but because a cartoon train told you so. And you believed it. It gave kids ownership of knowledge. It made learning feel cool. In a time before digital everything, it was one of the first shows to prove that entertainment could be smart without being boring. It was a soundtrack to childhood that made your brain sing. Back in the 1970s, having an Atari Pong system was like owning the future. It was not just a toy. It was the kind of thing that made your house the coolest one on the block. Rich kids had them hooked up to their living room televisions like it was no big deal. You would walk in and see two little rectangles knocking a square dot back and forth across the screen. But that square dot? It was power. That console cost serious money, and if your family was not ready to drop the equivalent of a couple $100, you were not getting one. Watching the commercials was like torture. They showed families sitting together on shag carpet, laughing like everything was perfect, holding those twisty knob controllers like they had cracked the code on life. It was simple, it was clean, and it felt just out of reach. What made it sting more was that Pong was not flashy. It was just well made. And that made it feel even more exclusive. You knew the kid who had it. You remember standing by awkwardly while they let you play one round and then snatch the controller back. They always had the upper hand. That little blip of a ball? It was the sound of them winning, and you watching from the side. In the 1970s, you could walk into any living room and find a macrame plant hanger swaying near the window. Handmade from twisted cords, thick yarn, or even old rope, these hangers were more than decoration. They were statements. Your mom or aunt probably made one at a craft night or picked one up at a flea market. They cradled ferns, spider plants, and anything green, sometimes hanging over orange shag carpeting or wood-paneled walls. Some had beads woven into the strands. Others had patterns that seemed to hypnotize you if you stared too long. They were often hung with a brass hook screwed right into the ceiling, dangerously close to ceiling fans or light fixtures. But no one cared. It was groovy. It was artistic. It was freedom and nature brought indoors. The macrame craze represented a return to earthiness and personal touch. You were not just buying a product, you were tying every knot yourself. And if you were not making one, someone you knew definitely was. These hangers aged, gathered dust, sometimes sagged under too much weight, but they were beloved. They matched the houseplants perfectly and brought warmth into every room. Seeing one today might feel like stepping into your grandmother's sunroom on a quiet afternoon, the scent of potting soil and lemon-scented furniture polish in the air. Space food sticks were NASA's answer to snacking and the 1960s answer to cool. Developed with the help of the space agency and manufactured by Pillsbury, these chewy, tube-shaped snacks were inspired by the meals eaten aboard spacecraft during America's race to the moon. They came in flavors like chocolate, peanut butter, and caramel, each one individually wrapped in sleek foil packaging that looked straight out of a science fiction movie. For kids, biting into a space food stick meant pretending you were floating in zero gravity, eating like an astronaut in orbit. They were soft, dense, and slightly grainy. Less candy bar, more futuristic fuel. Parents loved the idea of a high-protein, shelf-stable snack. Kids just liked the novelty. They made it into lunchboxes, road trip bags, and even Halloween candy stashes. Though their popularity waned by the 1980s, the memory stuck, especially for those who watched grainy broadcasts of moonwalks and then unwrapped their own little taste of space. Today, space food sticks are remembered more for what they represented than how they tasted. They were not just snacks. They were a bite of the future, wrapped in foil, waiting in your kitchen drawer. Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood was not flashy. It had no lasers, no puppets doing pratfalls, no catchy jingles, but it had something better, genuine warmth. Fred Rogers, with his cardigan sweater and calm voice, welcomed every child as if they were the most important person in the world. And to many, he was the only adult who ever did. Debuting in 1968 but shaping hearts well into the 1970s, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood was slow, simple, and radical in its kindness. It was not a show you watched for action. It was a show you watched to feel safe. Fred Rogers talked about emotions, anger, sadness, fear, and he did it without blinking. He told you it was okay to feel, that you were not alone, that being a child was hard, and that your feelings mattered. There was no pressure to be funny or smart or fast. You just had to be yourself. That was enough. The land of make-believe added whimsy, but it was always grounded in care. Mr. Rogers did not perform for you. He spoke to you, and that made all the difference. For many kids, his neighborhood was not just a television set, it was a sanctuary. A quiet reminder that love could be gentle and that you were loved just by being you. It was the closest thing to magic you could hold in your hand. The Mattel Vertibird did not just sit still like the rest of your toys, it moved, spun, hovered. A tiny helicopter circling on a wire like it had a mission to complete, and only the rich kids were cleared for takeoff. If you were lucky enough to know someone who had one, you probably remember standing in their basement watching it spin around that plastic console like it was something out of a movie. The controls felt impossibly smooth. The noise it made was like a real chopper, kind of loud, kind of annoying, but somehow still beautiful. It came in all kinds of kits, rescue missions, police chases, even space ones. But no matter the model, it came with a price tag that said, "This is not for just anyone." These were not toys you saw in your average toy aisle. They were always sitting high up, behind glass, or in department stores your family did not shop in. You could not just ask for a Vertibird. It had to be gifted by someone with a solid bank account and a soft spot. It was the kind of toy that made other toys look boring, and when it took flight, so did your envy. And when you asked your parents if you could have one, they would give you that look, the one that quietly said, "Not this year." The Vertibird was not a toy, it was a symbol. If you had one, you were living different. If you did not, you just stood back and watched it fly circles around everything you owned. Now this one hurt the most because it was not even a toy. Not yet. Shrinky Dinks were magic in plastic form. You started with a sheet, clear, flexible, and begging to be colored. You grabbed your markers, drew a wild design, cut it out with safety scissors, and popped it in the oven. What came out was a tiny, hardened version of your masterpiece, often warped but always perfect. Watching it shrink behind the oven door was part of the thrill. You would kneel on the floor, peering through the glass, and gasp as your drawing curled, twisted, and finally flattened. Kids made keychains, jewelry, ornaments. Whatever their imagination allowed, it felt like crafting with sorcery. One minute you were tracing cartoons or making friendship tags. The next you held a miniaturized relic in your palm. The smell of melting plastic filled the kitchen. Parents worried, but no one stopped us. Shrinky Dinks were affordable, creative, and wildly popular at every sleepover and birthday party. You could even buy branded kits, superheroes, cartoon characters, holiday themes. But the best ones were always your originals. There was something deeply satisfying about seeing your art transformed like that. Tiny, tough, and totally unique. We never questioned the process. We just knew it felt like creating something real, something small that still felt huge. Tangy Taffy was the candy you had to work for, and that was half the fun. Long before it became part of the Laffy Taffy brand, this chewy strip came in a thin plastic wrapper and offered a sweet, stretchy challenge for any sugar-loving kid in the 1960s. It came in vibrant colors and punchy flavors like grape, strawberry, and sour apple, each one delivering a jolt of sugar and just the right amount of tartness. You could bend it, stretch it, or roll it into a ball before finally taking a bite. The longer you chewed, the stronger the flavor got, which made it perfect for kids trying to make a nickel's worth of candy last the whole afternoon. Sometimes it stuck to your teeth. Sometimes it stuck to the wrapper. But it was always worth it. Tangy Taffy was less about elegance and more about fun, bright, bold, and unapologetically sweet. For many kids, it was the ultimate playground treat, swapped on school buses or bought from corner stores with pocket change. Today's candies may be smoother or flashier, but they cannot match the simple satisfaction of a taffy you could stretch, fold, and chew until your jaw hurt. HR Pufnstuf was like opening a children's storybook that had somehow exploded onto your television screen. It was colorful, chaotic, and completely unlike anything else on the air. Premiering in 1969 but reigning throughout the early 1970s, it featured a dragon mayor, talking trees, witches, and a boy named Jimmy who got stranded on a magical island. and every episode felt like a fever dream you wanted to revisit. The puppets were huge and bizarre, the sets looked like candy-coated acid trips, and for kids used to more grounded shows, HR Pufnstuf felt like stepping into another dimension. But beneath the strangeness, there was heart. Each episode had lessons about friendship, trust, bravery, but wrapped in surreal layers of fantasy. It was imaginative in the most unfiltered way. It did not ask permission to be weird, it just was. And you either jumped on board or missed out entirely. For kids who felt different, this was a show that said, "Weird is wonderful." It gave permission to dream big, to be strange, to laugh at the absurd. It was chaotic and clumsy, but always sincere. HR Pufnstuf was not just television. It was an invitation to believe in something a little more magical than the world around you. Every time you saw it in a catalog, it looked like joy in a box. A bright red roof, that big white dog on top, and a little hand crank that promised a mountain of shaved ice on a hot summer day. The Snoopy snow cone machine was not just a toy, it was an event. And if you had it, you threw the kind of parties that kids remembered. It came with little paper cups, tiny flavor packets, and a scoop shaped like Snoopy's head. Everything about it screamed deluxe. But the truth? That thing barely worked. The crank was stiff, the ice melted fast, and the syrup ran out in 5 minutes. And still, everyone wanted it. It was sticky, messy, and almost always disappointing, and yet no one cared. The act of making the snow cone mattered more than eating it. The kid who had it was the one who got to stand behind the counter, smiling like a carnival vendor. You wanted it, because it meant your family could afford fun. It meant you had a kitchen big enough for a snow cone stand and parents who did not mind the mess. It was never about the taste. It was about showing off. The kid who had it only made snow cones a few times a year, but you would never forget watching them do it. You stood in line behind 6 other kids just to get a watered-down cherry slush in a cup half the size of your palm. But that did not matter. You were part of it for 5 minutes, and then it was over. Before you could run to the freezer aisle for a rainbow box of treats, there was Mom's kitchen. And in that kitchen were Tupperware popsicle molds, pastel-colored, slightly sticky, and always in the bottom drawer. You filled them with orange juice, Kool-Aid, or whatever soda was left over. Then you popped on the plastic stick tops, placed them in the freezer, and waited. The waiting was the hardest part. You checked every 10 minutes, you tapped the sides. You asked Mom if they were ready yet. And finally, when they were frozen solid, you ran to the counter and twisted. Sometimes they slid right out. Sometimes you had to run them under warm water for what felt like forever. But the result was always worth it. Homemade popsicles, cold, sweet, and uneven. One might be syrupy, another mostly ice. You never knew, but it was yours. Made by you. That tiny sense of accomplishment melted faster than the treat itself. Sticky fingers, drips down your arm. A moment of pride on a hot afternoon. Tupperware popsicle molds were not flashy, but they were practical, nostalgic, and endlessly fun. Long before popsicles came in plastic wrappers with cartoon mascots, this was the taste of summer at home. Television commercials in the 1960s were more than just breaks between shows. They were cultural events in miniature. With only a few channels and no fast-forward buttons, families watched together as jingles and catchphrases embedded themselves in the national memory. Plop, plop, fizz, fizz. You already know the rest. These ads had staying power. Cereal mascots danced across the screen. Soap commercials turned kitchens into laboratories. And toy ads? They were irresistible. From Slinky to Mr. Potato Head, kids begged for whatever had just aired during Saturday morning cartoons. Commercials were peppy, earnest, and often downright charming. They starred smiling housewives, enthusiastic children, and baritone narrators who made even laundry detergent sound heroic. These were the years when brands did not just sell products. They sold a lifestyle, a vision of modern convenience and happiness. Parents trusted what they saw. Kids repeated the jingles under their breath. Even decades later, people can still sing along to a tune they heard once before dinner in 1966. Commercials from the 1960s did not just advertise. They became part of family rhythm, part of shared language, and part of what made the television glow a little brighter after each show. The Brady Bunch was a family like no other, and yet it felt like everyone's family. 6 kids, 2 parents, and a house full of laughter, chaos, and pastel-colored drama. Premiering in 1969, but becoming a cultural mainstay throughout the 1970s, it was pure television comfort food. Every episode ended with a smile, a hug, and a catchy lesson on sharing, honesty, or sibling rivalry. It was not edgy. It was not deep. But it was warm. And for kids whose homes were not always so perfect, the Brady Bunch offered a glimpse of what harmony could look like, even if it was idealized. Mike and Carol never yelled. Alice the housekeeper always had a one-liner ready. And the kids? They were just messy enough to be real. You picked a favorite. You sang along with the theme song. You quoted Jan's iconic "Marcia, Marcia, Marcia." It was pop culture innocence. A time capsule of bell-bottoms, perms, and avocado-colored kitchens. And even if you rolled your eyes at the cheese, deep down you loved that family, because they showed that even the most blended bunch could belong. And that felt revolutionary in its own gentle way. These were not your little brother's bricks. The Lego Expert Builder series, before it became Technic, was for the serious kids, the ones who had toolboxes, blueprints, and an attention span longer than 10 minutes. But here's the thing, these kits were expensive, and rich kids got them for birthdays or holidays with barely a blink. You saw them crack open the box, spread out all those tiny gears and rods, and start building like it was their job. The box said, ages 9 and up, but it might as well have said, you cannot afford this. It was more than just Lego. It was mechanical. Pistons, axles, moving parts. You could build a car and then actually steer it. For a lot of us, that was like holding an engine from the future. You could hear the click of gears and feel the snap of every piece sliding perfectly into place. These sets were not just about building. They were about control, precision, pride. And every time you saw one finished, you wondered what it felt like to be trusted with something so complex. Most kids never touched these. They were locked behind price tags and parent logic that said, you will lose the pieces. Maybe they were right. But it still stung when your friend came to school bragging about building a V8 engine out of Lego. Pop beads were not just a craft, they were a lifestyle. These chunky, colorful plastic beads snapped together with a satisfying click, turning into necklaces, bracelets, tiaras, or anything else your imagination dreamed up. Every little girl had a box of them. Every slumber party included at least one fashion show. But pop beads were more than accessories. They were building blocks. They were puzzles. They were surprisingly strong and endlessly versatile. You could pull them apart to start over or wear your creation all day like it was made of gold. They came in every color of the rainbow. Some were clear, some were glittery, some looked like tiny candies. And yes, sometimes you chewed on them even though you were not supposed to. Sometimes they turned into weapons, flicked across the room or used to bind your younger sibling. That was half the fun. Pop beads were part toy, part rebellion. They made you feel creative, independent, grown up even, until one popped off and vanished under the couch, never to be seen again. You always lost one, but the set never felt incomplete. You just made a shorter necklace. Pop beads were a rite of passage in childhood, bright, noisy, and totally unforgettable. Rotary phones were more than a way to talk. They were a ritual. Heavy, anchored to a table or wall and connected by a coiled cord, these phones had a satisfying weight and a rhythm all their own. Each number you dialed had to be carefully selected with a finger, spun around the circular dial, and released with a soft whir. If you dialed the wrong digit near the end, start over. It took patience, and that was part of the charm. You memorized numbers, you waited your turn. And when the phone rang, it was a real ring, loud, metallic, and impossible to ignore. Talking on the rotary phone meant stretching the cord down the hallway for privacy, wrapping it around your fingers during a long conversation, and sometimes having to politely ask someone to hang up because it was your turn to use it. There were no voicemails, no caller ID, just trust, timing, and the occasional busy signal. Today, a rotary phone feels like a relic, but for many growing up in the 1960s, it was a constant companion. From late-night talks to awkward first calls, its clicks and clatters are etched in memory like the voices it once carried. The Muppet Show was barely controlled chaos, and that was exactly the point. Hosted by the endlessly stressed Kermit the Frog, it brought puppets and celebrities together in a late-night variety show that aired in prime time but captured the hearts of kids everywhere. Launched in 1976, it was not just a puppet show, it was the Puppet Show. Gonzo, Miss Piggy, Fozzie Bear, Animal. These were not background characters, they were stars. The sketches were wacky, the musical numbers were weird. And the jokes, they were sometimes just a little over your head. But you laughed anyway, because the Muppets were alive. They bickered, they loved, they failed spectacularly. And that made them feel human. It was beautiful chaos, held together by heart and felt. For many kids, it was their first taste of satire, of theater, of performance. And it stuck. It felt like a secret shared between generations. Kids laughed at the slapstick, adults smiled at the subtext. The Muppet Show was fun, yes. But it was also oddly emotional. These puppets had dreams. They wanted applause. And watching them chase that, week after week, made you want to chase your own. It looked like a toy until it started playing. The Panasonic Take-N-Tape was a little portable cassette recorder that kids used to tape their voices, play their favorite songs, or pretend they were running a radio show. And it was not cheap. It came in bright colors, had a chunky handle, and most importantly, it worked. It felt professional. Rich kids would bring them to school to record class projects, or worse, just record nothing at all, just because they could. You wanted one, not because you needed it, but because it made sound feel personal. These were the first steps toward a world where kids could make things, songs, stories, messages, and hear them played back. It was powerful. If you had one, you felt like your voice mattered. If you did not, you just watched and wondered how it felt to press record and actually have something worth taping. The big wheel tricycle was not quiet. It was not smooth. It did not have gears or brakes or padding, but in the 1970s, it was everything. Made of hard plastic, it sat low to the ground with a giant front wheel and two tiny ones in back. It made you feel fast, cool, and slightly invincible. The handlebars squeaked. The wheels clicked. Every turn was a drift. Every ride was a race. You could spin out on the sidewalk like a stunt driver. You could chase your friends down the block, legs pumping wildly, plastic wheels screaming in protest. The seat usually wobbled. The stickers peeled off after a week. But none of that mattered. The big wheel was freedom. It did not look like a tricycle. It looked like something better, sleeker, edgier. You did not just ride it. You rode into battle, or the corner store, or the backyard dirt track you called the racetrack. It scuffed your shoes. It burned holes in your knees. But you loved it. There was something about sitting that low, hearing the thunder of your wheels and feeling like you could outrun the whole neighborhood. For a generation of kids, it was not just a toy, it was a throne. Slide projectors were the original family theater. Before smartphones and digital albums, the only way to share vacation photos was by dimming the lights, pulling down a screen or a blank wall, and clicking through a carousel of 35mm slides. You could hear the quiet hum of the machine, the mechanical clunk as each new photo dropped into place, and the occasional groan from someone who had already seen them twice. But there was magic in it. These evenings were about more than just pictures. They were about storytelling. The beach trip where Dad sunburned his feet. The blurry shot of Grandma mid-sneeze. The perfectly framed sunset over the Grand Canyon. Families would laugh, tease, and remember together, sometimes with popcorn, always with commentary. The projector cast not just images, but atmosphere, the darkened room, the warmth of shared memory, and the feeling that what you were seeing mattered because everyone else was seeing it too. Slide projectors may be obsolete now, but for those who grew up in the 1960s, they were a rite of passage, a way to relive moments in slow, glowing frames, one dusty click at a time. Mood rings promise to reveal your soul with nothing but heat-sensitive liquid and a silver band. They hit stores in the 1970s and immediately became a cultural phenomenon. Kids were obsessed. What color was yours? Blue meant calm. Green meant normal. Black meant, well, probably nothing good. But did the colors really reflect your emotions? Of course not. Still, that did not matter. It felt like magic, like your feelings were finally visible, like someone could see how you felt without you having to explain it. And in a decade where kids were just starting to explore self-expression, that meant something. Mood rings were not flashy. They were not expensive, but they made you feel seen. Like a tiny piece of jewelry could make sense of the chaos in your chest. You wore it to school. You compared with friends. You checked it constantly. Not because it worked, but because you wanted it to. It became part of your identity. And even though you knew deep down it was just science reacting to body temperature, you believed the story. That was the power of being a kid in the 1970s. You let the world be strange and beautiful and just a little bit magical. So before you go, tell us which of these forgotten sitcoms made you laugh the hardest. Then hit like, tap subscribe, and drop your own memories in the comments so we can all keep the laughter of the 1970s alive together.